The great hall of Ashworth Park blazed with candlelight on the 23rd of November, 1848, every chandelier lit to its furthest wick, every mirror angled to multiply the flames, until the room appeared to float inside its own private sun. Cold pressed against the tall windows from the parkland beyond, but within, the assembled guests of Lord Alderman Carew's autumn convocation moved in their silks and their tailcoats like figures in a mechanism that had been wound too tightly, each gesture precise and calculated, each smile delivered to its correct address. The musicians in the gallery played Handel without flaw or feeling. The footmen stood at measured intervals along the walls, still as furniture. The flowers, white chrysanthemums banked along every mantelpiece, ordered 3 days prior from a florist in Bath, at a cost Imogen had negotiated down by 11 shillings per arrangement, released their faint, bitter scent into the heated air. And at the edge of all that calculated magnificence, half concealed behind the near pillar of the east colonnade, her back to the room as she pinned the loosening anchor of the largest chrysanthemum arrangement back into its wire frame, with hands that did not tremble, was Imogen Ashby. She wore gray. It was the correct dress for a woman in her position, which was to say, no particular position at all. She was neither guest nor servant, but the thing that occupied the narrow territory between them, the Lord's late wife's niece, resident at Ashworth Park for 7 years, manager of its household accounts since the 3rd year of her residence, when old Mr. Carew had discovered she had quietly corrected a creditor's bill that had overcharged him by £42. She was 28 years of age, and she had been doing necessary things in this house since she was 21, and she had learned that the people who noticed her at all did so only when something was wrong. The pin held. She stepped back, assessed the arrangement, and turned to face the room. The Duke of Wentmore had arrived. She knew him by the particular stillness he created as he entered. It was not that the crowd parted exactly. The mechanism was too refined for anything so theatrical. But a series of small recalibrations moved through the assembled guests, like a single key struck on the pianoforte. Spines straightened, conversations adjusted their register, and 3 young women in the center of the room turned with a synchronized precision that no choreographer could have improved. Frederick Ashmore, 5th Duke of Wentmore, was 34 years old, reportedly in possession of 40,000 acres in 2 counties and a house in Grosvenor Square, and had been unmarried long enough that his continued bachelorhood had achieved the status of a public inconvenience. He was tall and wore black without any ornament except a single watch chain of plain gold. His face was not what Imogen would have called handsome in any ordinary sense. It was too constructed for that, all strong planes and measured distance, as though whichever sculptor had been responsible had prioritized function over ease. He moved through the room without pausing, without dazzling, without performing any version of a rival. He exchanged nods with 2 men she recognized as his solicitors, and then he stood with his back to the east wall and looked at the room with the particular attention of someone completing a task they have prepared for thoroughly and expected to find tedious. His gaze passed across the near colonnade. It found the chrysanthemum arrangement. It held there for one fraction of a moment, not on the flowers, she understood, but on the woman who had just finished repairing them. It was not admiration. It was not desire. It was the measuring attention of someone who has just observed a thing that does not fit the category they prepared for it, and has filed the discrepancy for later consideration. Then the attention moved on. Lord Carew was approaching with both hands extended, and a smile like a man presenting the answer to a question the Duke had not asked. Imogen picked up her household list from the shelf behind the pillar and returned to the business of keeping the evening standing. She had come to Ashworth Park in February of 1841. 3 months after her father's death in a coaching accident on the Exeter Road. Her father, Thomas Ashby, had been a solicitor of modest practice and immodest ambitions, a man who had kept better ledgers for his clients than for his own household, and who had died, owing £730 to 4 separate creditors, leaving Imogen with the house in Salisbury, the debt, and the discovery that the house was already the subject of a repayment agreement he had signed and not mentioned. She had been 21. She had sat in her father's study for one afternoon and done what he had taught her to do, which was to find the actual number before making any decisions based on the imagined one. The actual number was clear. There was no version of the house that she could keep. There was, however, a great-uncle by marriage in Somerset, who had written twice in the previous decade to suggest she might benefit from a visit, and whose letter she had never answered. She answered it now. Lord Carew had been, in those early years, a man of genuine if distracted kindness. His wife, Lady Carew, had welcomed Imogen as something between a companion and an upper servant, which was, Imogen had understood immediately, the only category available to a woman with her education and her absence of fortune. She had arrived with 2 trunks, a thorough working knowledge of double-entry bookkeeping, and the absolute private determination not to become someone who waited for circumstances to improve. The estate had not been well managed. That was apparent within a fortnight of her arrival. Not dishonestly, the steward, Mr. Hartwell, was a conscientious man with insufficient training in modern accounting, but carelessly, in the particular way that comes from years of no one checking one column against another. Imogen had begun checking. She had done it quietly, in the evenings, after Lady Carew retired. By the spring of 1842, she had identified 4 duplicate creditor entries, 1 supplier contract charging 11% above the agreed rate, and a wool merchant agreement that had lapsed in 1839 and had been renewed at terms significantly worse than what the market would have offered. She had presented her findings to Mr. Hartwell in private, framed as questions rather than corrections, and he had been grateful in the specific way of a man who understood he was being spared an embarrassment he had not earned. By the winter of 1843, she was managing the household accounts directly. No title was attached to this, no additional compensation. She received £12 annually for her keep, the same arrangement Lady Carew had established at her arrival. The work she had quietly absorbed was worth considerably more than that, and she knew it with precision. She had priced it at £48 per annum, against comparable estate management costs in the county, a figure she had arrived at from the estate's own correspondence with a neighboring property. She did not raise the matter. Lady Carew died in the spring of 1844, and Lord Carew's attention contracted inward for 2 years, and Imogen ran the household because no one else was going to, and because not running it would have meant watching it fall into disorder that would have cost real money and real damage to the tenant farmers who depended on the estate's stability. The moment she had come closest to being less than herself had occurred in the winter of 1845. A creditor, a man named Greer, who held a wool supply agreement that Imogen had already renegotiated twice, had come to the house when Lord Carew was in London and had made a proposal that was not about wool. He had been neither violent nor subtle about it. He had simply observed that a woman in her position was unlikely to find her objections listened to, and that his cooperation with the estate's supply needs might be made considerably more agreeable by a different kind of arrangement. She had been seated behind the estate desk with the current wool ledger open in front of her. She had looked at him with the particular stillness of a person who has already calculated their response before the conversation began. Then she had opened the ledger to the page she needed, placed it on the desk so that he could read it from where he stood, and told him precisely which entries would be submitted to Lord Carew's solicitor if she were required to explain why the current agreement was terminating. She had given him the name of the solicitor, the address, and the approximate date the correspondence would arrive. He had left without the new terms and without pursuing the other proposal further. She had sat alone in the estate office for perhaps 5 minutes after he left. Then she had returned to the accounts. There had not been a version of that afternoon where she became smaller in order to survive it. There was not going to be one now. By the autumn of 1848, she had been managing the Ashworth Park estate accounts for 5 years with a degree of competence that had saved the estate, by her own careful reckoning, approximately £420 annually in recovered margin from renegotiated supplier agreements, corrected billing errors, and improved tenant lease terms. Lord Carew knew this in the general way of a man who understood that things worked well and attributed it vaguely to his own oversight. He was not unkind. He did not look very carefully. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like acknowledgement. What she had not known until the evening of the convocation was that she had been counted at all. Frederick, Duke of Wentmore, had received his investigator's report on the 8th of October, 6 weeks before the autumn convocation. He had read it in the library of his Grosvenor Square house, between 7 and 9 in the evening, alone, with a glass of Burgundy he had not finished. The report was thorough, because he had paid for thoroughness. His man, an ex-chancery clerk named Poole, was skilled at finding the true structure of a household beneath the presented one. Poole's report on Ashworth Park ran to 14 pages. The first 6 covered what Frederick had already assessed from public record. the estate's finances, the state of the title, the two acceptable candidates Lord Carew had been presenting to eligible men of rank for the past 18 months. The first was Miss Honoria Carew, the Lord's niece by blood, 22 years of age, and recently returned from a finishing year in Bath. The second was Miss Felicity Drummond, daughter of a connected Wiltshire family, 20 years of age, accomplished in French and watercolor, with a prospective settlement that her father had made quietly known in suitable circles. Frederick had met both young women at the previous year's county assembly. He had found nothing wrong with either of them. He had also found nothing that solved what he needed solved. He had been searching for something that he could not describe easily as a quality, but which he recognized in its absence everywhere he looked. Someone who understood, in a practical and unsentimental way, what the work of an estate actually required. His mother, the late Duchess, had been such a person. She had died when Frederick was 16, and the estate had required 11 years to recover, not from grief, though there had been enough of that, but from the specific operational collapse that followed the removal of the one person who had understood all of it simultaneously. His father had hired 3 stewards in succession. None had managed what his mother had done alone. He had been at Wentmore for 10 years, since inheriting at 24. He had repaired most of what was repairable. He had also come to understand, with the quiet certainty of a man who took accurate inventory before making decisions, that the thing his mother had provided was not a service you could contract for. It was a particular kind of intelligence, applied to a particular kind of problem, daily, across decades. You could not hire it, you had to choose it. The last 8 pages of Poole's report were about Imogen Ashby. Poole had, characteristically, buried the most significant material. He noted her formal position, resident companion, dependent relation, and then proceeded to lay out, with the annotated invoice copies he had obtained from the estate's bath suppliers, the actual scope of what she managed. 14 renegotiated supply agreements in 5 years. A tenant lease restructure in 1846 that had increased the estate's annual return by £63 while reducing delinquent payment rates to 0. A creditor correspondence file, apparently begun in her 2nd year of residence, that documented every billing discrepancy she had identified and resolved, cross-referenced by supplier and year. There was a footnote on the final page. Poole wrote, with the particular neutrality of a man who recognized when a finding exceeded the scope of his commission, Miss Ashby receives no stated compensation beyond her original arrangements, and carries no title reflecting her function. She appears to manage the Ashworth Park estate accounts fully and has done so for approximately 5 years. She is not, to my assessment, a woman of great social visibility. She is, however, the reason this estate is solvent. Frederick had set the report down and looked at the fire for some time. He attended the convocation because the investigator's description was precise but not sufficient. He needed to see what Poole's 14 pages had not been able to document, which was the quality of her attention in a room. A person could manage accounts with diligence and still be someone the estate buried. He needed to know the other thing. He had seen it in the first 4 minutes, when her back was turned to a room full of people trying to make impressions on him, and she was repairing a flower arrangement with the unhurried concentration of someone who knew the arrangement mattered and had no interest in being observed to know it. He had returned to find her 30 minutes later and could not locate her for a quarter of an hour, which told him something further. She was working in a room full of social performance without performing anything. He asked Lord Carew where his niece was keeping herself. Lord Carew looked temporarily confused, as though the question were in a language he had not expected, and then redirected Frederick toward Miss Honoria Carew, who was stationed in the center of the drawing room in a pale blue gown designed for exactly this occasion. Frederick spoke with Miss Carew for 7 minutes. She was gracious and composed and spoke of Bath with genuine pleasure. She would have managed a household capably, he thought. She would not have saved it. He found Imogen Ashby at 9:30, standing at the far end of the supper table, reviewing what appeared to be a written list. She did not look up when he approached. When she did look up, she registered his presence with neither calculation nor performance, simply the level attention of someone who had been at work and was now being interrupted, and was adjusting accordingly. "The chrysanthemums in the east colonnade," he said. The anchor pin was failing. She was quiet for 1 moment. "It was. I replaced it at 7:45. The florist is the Holbrook establishment in Bath, I would think. The arrangement is their signature architecture." "It is. I negotiated their rate down considerably from what they proposed. They do good work when held to reasonable terms." And she had not said it to impress him. She had said it because it was the accurate additional information. He had filed this also. He left the supper table without introducing himself formally, because he already knew who she was, and because the work he had now decided to do would require seeing whether her quality held outside of this room. He attended 2 further conversations, spoke briefly with Lord Carew about the following spring's county committee, and departed at 11. He stood outside on the gravel, as his carriage was brought around, and looked at the lit windows for a moment. The decision was already made, as his decisions tended to be, once the evidence was adequate. He did not mistake this for certainty about everything. There was more to learn about her, more to understand, but the direction was fixed. He wrote to his solicitor the following morning. She arrived at Wentmore Hall on the 3rd of January, 1849. Lord Carew had presented the proposition with the undisguised satisfaction of a man who had just learned that something he had not thought to value had turned out to be worth considerable social currency. The Duke of Wentmore, he had explained, was seeking a woman of genuine capability to assist in the organization of the estate's household, a trial arrangement lasting through the spring quarter, with the understanding that it might expand to a more permanent arrangement should both parties find it suitable. He had used the word arrangement 4 times in 3 minutes, and had not once used the word marriage, which was the word that was actually in the letter Frederick's solicitor had sent. Imogen had read the letter herself, because Lord Carew had passed it to her to verify she understood the terms. She had read it twice, folded it along its original creases, and handed it back. Then she had returned to the accounts she had been working on before his summons, because she had 2 creditor reviews outstanding, and the knowledge that she might be leaving Ashworth Park in 3 weeks did not change the fact that the accounts needed to be correct before she went. She had taken one evening to sit with the question alone, not because she was overwhelmed. She had managed too much for too long to be overwhelmed by a letter, but because the decision deserved her full attention, applied honestly, not merely the attention she was accustomed to giving to problems that had already been decided for her. She had not imagined, at 28, that anyone of consequence was going to look at her and see something of value that was not primarily her usefulness as an unpaid functionary. She was not bitter about this. She was simply accurate about it. And accuracy required her to also consider that this might be exactly what the Duke intended, a more formally useful unpaid functionary, elevated in title but unchanged in substance. She had concluded that the only way to know was to go. She was not going to make herself smaller in anticipation of a disappointment that had not yet arrived. She would go to Wentmore Hall and do what she did, and see what he actually was, and decide from there. She arrived to find the housekeeper, a solid, warm-voiced woman of 50, named Mrs. Elspeth Grant, waiting at the front door with 2 footmen and a cup of tea that she pressed into Imogen's hands before any formal introduction had been completed. "You'll want something hot before I show you anything," Mrs. Grant said, in the tone of a woman who had long ago made a private decision about how to treat people correctly, regardless of instruction. "The January wind, on this side of the valley, is not a civilized thing." Imogen had been managing households for 7 years. She recognized immediately and completely that she was in the presence of someone who was going to make this place workable, and felt something she could not quite call relief. It was older and quieter than that. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with precision. Mrs. Grant showed her the house in sections over 2 days, the household accounts office, the linen stores, the kitchen accounts, the tenant ledgers. The estate was large, substantially larger than Ashworth Park, and the household ran to 22 permanent staff, with additional seasonal arrangements in summer. The accounts were organized but not fine-tuned. Imogen could see within the first morning's review approximately where the inefficiencies lived. She did not say anything yet. She observed, and recorded, and made her own notes. The Duke was largely absent for those first 2 days, which she had not expected and found, on consideration, correct. He was giving her space to see the house without him in it, which was the action of someone who understood the value of accurate first impressions. On the 3rd day he appeared in the household accounts office at 10 in the morning, knocked once on the open door, and said, "I would hear your initial assessment, if you have one." She had one. She had been working on it since the first evening. She laid 3 pages of notes on the desk between them. She had organized them by category: supply agreements that warranted renegotiation, with estimated recovered margin; staff scheduling patterns that were inefficient, with suggested adjustments; a tenant ledger entry that appeared to carry a duplicate charge across two separate accounts. She did not summarize or minimize. She presented what she had found. He read all 3 pages without speaking. She watched him read, the way she watched a balance sheet come into focus, looking for what his attention paused on, what it moved past, what he turned back to. He turned back to the tenant ledger note. This duplicate entry, how long has it been carried? At least 4 years, by the ledger dates I could access. Possibly longer. It is a small amount annually, but the tenant in question will have overpaid by at least £11 across that period. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want it corrected and a reimbursement arranged. I'll draft the letter today. He set down the pages. He looked at her with an attention that was not comfortable or discomforting, but simply direct, the gaze of someone who was also taking accurate inventory. You are not what I was promised, he said. She did not react to this immediately. She allowed the sentence to land and then assessed it. Lord Carew's description was not precise. His description was generous and entirely wrong in its categories. He described you as an accomplished and well-bred young woman of excellent domestic character. He did not mention the renegotiated supplier agreements, the recovered annual margin, the tenant lease restructure of 1846, or the creditor correspondence file you began in your 2nd year of residence. She was still for a moment. Then she said, You engaged an investigator. I did. Poole, he is thorough. He would have needed access to the estate office. He had access to the bath supplier's invoice records. The rest was inference, competently made. She found that she was not angry about this, which surprised her slightly. What she felt was the particular thing that comes from being seen accurately after a long time of being described incorrectly. It was not comfortable exactly. It was too unfamiliar for comfort, but it was something she recognized as true. And what did Poole's inference conclude? That you were the reason the estate is solvent, Frederick said, with the particular directness of a man who had decided to say the accurate thing, even when the accurate thing was unexpectedly large. He is correct. She held this without responding for a moment. Then she picked up her notes and aligned their edges with the desk. The duplicate tenant entry will be resolved by Friday, she said. The supply agreement review will take somewhat longer. I'll have a full assessment by the end of the month. He had left without asking for anything further, which told her something she was not yet ready to name. There was a woman named Miss Constance Alderley, who arrived at Wentmore Hall on the 14th of January, with her mother and a quantity of luggage that required 3 footmen and a second carriage. She was 24 years old, dark-haired, exceptionally accomplished in the ways that were considered relevant to a ducal alliance, and she had been quietly positioned by her family for the past 3 years as the natural next Duchess of Wentmore. Her mother, Mrs. Alderley, moved through the house with the proprietary ease of someone mentally rearranging its furniture. Miss Constance herself was not unkind. She was simply certain, in the serene and absolute way of someone who has never had a serious reason to be uncertain. She noticed Imogen on the second morning of her visit, in the way that a person notices a piece of household equipment they had not expected to see operating independently. You are Lord Carew's relation, she said, in the morning room over tea, with a smile that was technically pleasant. The household manager. I am assisting with the estate accounts, Imogen said. How useful. Miss Alderley's tone completed the sentence that her words had left open, which was, how appropriate that you are useful in a way that requires nothing further of you. Imogen returned to her accounts. She had an ally she had not anticipated in a young woman named Miss Philippa Forsyth, daughter of the local vicar, who visited the hall twice weekly and had decided within 4 minutes of meeting Imogen that she liked her better than almost anyone she had encountered since returning from school in Oxford. Philippa was 25, direct to the point of occasional social inconvenience, and had views about the management of rural estates that were considerably more informed than most people expected from a vicar's daughter. She is going to be perfectly dreadful to you, Philippa said, on the afternoon of Miss Alderley's 3rd day, sitting across from Imogen, in the household accounts office, with her legs drawn up beneath her, in a posture Mrs. Alderley would have found alarming. Not dramatically. She is too intelligent for dramatics. Just persistently. You should prepare for that. I am not unprepared for persistent, Imogen said. No, I don't imagine you are. There was also Sir Edmund Pelham, a retired Chancery Court recorder, who had served as the Wentmore estate advisor for 22 years, and whom Imogen encountered in the estate library on the morning of her 5th day. He was 71, white-haired, with the careful posture of a man who had spent decades in rooms where precision mattered, and he looked at the annotated supply contract she was reviewing and said, without preamble, "You found the August clause." She had. The August clause was a renewal provision in the main hay supply agreement that allowed the supplier to adjust pricing annually by up to 8% without notification, an arrangement which had resulted in a cumulative increase of 31% over 4 years, well above market rate. "I have," she said. "I was going to present it to His Grace next week." "Present it sooner," Sir Edmund said. "He is going to need it before then, if I read the coming meeting correctly." She looked at him. "Which meeting?" He settled into the chair across from her and told her. The meeting was on the 22nd of January. It was a quarterly review conducted by a body that Frederick's father, the 4th Duke, dead these 10 years, had convened, a council of 7 investors and regional creditors who held minority interests in the estate's agricultural development projects. The 4th Duke had required their capital in 1830 to fund the eastern drainage works. Frederick had inherited both the works and the obligation to maintain the council's quarterly reviews. The council was led in practical terms by a man named Alderman Forsyth Greaves, no relation to Philippa, who had been the 4th Duke's primary creditor, and who had transferred his interest to his son, a man of 40, named Horace Greaves, upon his death. Horace Greaves had never liked Frederick. He had not liked the 4th Duke either, but he had at least known how to manage him. Frederick was harder to manage because he was harder to read, and people who found him difficult to read tended to work around him rather than with him. The arrangement the council intended to present at the January meeting, Sir Edmund informed Imogen, was a revised investment structure that would extend the council's interest in the estate's timber revenues for an additional 20 years, in exchange for writing down a portion of the outstanding drainage debt. It was presented as a generous offer. Sir Edmund had done the mathematics. "It is not generous," he said. He looked at her across the desk with the particular expression of a man who has been waiting for someone to do the mathematics alongside him. "It is a long-term revenue extraction that will cost the estate approximately twice the written-down debt over the life of the agreement, but the paperwork is arranged to make it appear favorable on the headline figures, and the January meeting is being called on 3 weeks' notice, which does not give adequate time for a full analysis under normal circumstances." "Under normal circumstances," Imogen said. He looked at her. She was already reaching for the timber revenue ledgers. She worked for 7 days. She worked mornings in the accounts office, afternoons in the estate library, and 2 evenings past midnight at the desk in her room, with the household's oil lamp turned as high as it would go. She mapped the timber revenues against the proposed extension terms across 4 scenarios, constructed a comparison table showing the net estate position under the council's proposal versus 3 alternative debt restructures she had identified from the estate's existing correspondence, and prepared a documented summary with the relevant ledger entries attached. On the 18th of January, she found Frederick in the estate library at 7:30 in the evening. He was reading correspondence, and he looked up when she entered, without appearing surprised, as though the presence of someone arriving with a purpose at 7:30 was a reasonable development. She put the document set on the table beside him. "The January council meeting," she said. He looked at the document set. He picked it up and read the first page in silence. Then he went back to the beginning and read it again, more slowly. She sat in the chair across from him and waited. "The 20-year extension costs twice the debt write-down," he said when he reached the comparison table. 2.5 times. In the scenario where timber prices hold at current market rates. Slightly less if prices fall, but still negative against the baseline. And the alternative you've proposed here, the structured repayment across 8 years. It costs more in the short term by approximately £300 annually, but the estate retains full timber revenue after year 8. Over 20 years, the net difference is £1,800 in the estate's favor. He was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the comparison table with the particular concentration of someone who was not only reading the numbers, but reading the intelligence behind the construction of the numbers. "You did this in 7 days," he said. Sir Edmund provided the investment records. "The methodology is standard. I've done similar analyses for Lord Carew's supplier agreements, though on a smaller scale." "It is not a smaller scale skill," he said. There was nothing in his voice that she could call warm, exactly. It was too precise for warmth. But it was something she recognized as the particular register of a person speaking to an equal, which was a register she had not heard applied to herself in a very long time. He set the document set on the desk between them, carefully, as though it were an instrument that deserved that treatment. She noticed that his cravat was crooked. It had been crooked for some time, she suspected. The afternoon, perhaps. And the particular angle of the fold suggested it had loosened and been retied without access to a mirror. She did not think about this. She simply reached across the 2 feet of space between their chairs and straightened it, settling the fold into its correct alignment with 2 brief, light adjustments of her fingers, and then returned her hands to her own lap. He had not moved. "It has been crooked since approximately 3 o'clock, she said, without apology or explanation. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she was beginning to recognize, not quite readable, not quite still, somewhere between the two, in a territory she did not yet have a name for. Then he said, very quietly, "I am aware of that." She picked up her own copy of the notes and returned to the comparison table. "I'll have the complete documentation ready by the morning of the 22nd, she said. They worked in the library until 10:30, reviewing the document set together and refining the terms of the alternative proposal. She noted, without particular acknowledgement, that he deferred to her figures twice and overrode her once, on a point about timber market variability, where his direct knowledge of the estate's historical price records was more complete than hers. She revised the relevant scenario accordingly. He watched her revise it without comment, and she understood that the absence of comment was itself a form of acknowledgement. She learned, during that evening, that he had not slept well since November. He mentioned this in passing, in the context of the estate correspondence he had been reviewing when she arrived, and she filed it without comment. She learned also that the library had been his mother's favorite room. He said this only once, briefly, in answer to her question about the organization of the Historical Ledger Archive, but the particular flatness with which he said it told her everything about the 14 years that had passed since his mother died, and how little of the room's original quality had been maintained in the interim. She did not say anything about this, but the following morning she asked Mrs. Grant, who had originally organized the library's household records, and, upon learning it had been the late Duchess herself, spent an hour reviewing the archive's original categorization system and restored it to its correct structure. She did not mention this to anyone. On the morning of the 22nd of January, Imogen entered the council chamber at Wentmore Hall at 5 minutes before 9. The chamber was the estate's formal business room. A long table, 7 chairs on one side, 2 on the other, a fire that had been lit too recently to have properly warmed the room. Horace Greaves was already seated at the center of the 7, flanked by 3 colleagues on each side, and he looked at Imogen's entrance with the particular expression of a man who has organized a room to contain a specific kind of meeting and has just seen a variable arrive that does not belong in his preparation. Frederick was already at the head of the table. He did not look at her when she entered, which she understood as correct. Any acknowledgement in that moment would have been read as private, and what was about to happen needed to be public and documented. "Mr. Greaves," Frederick said, "I believe we may proceed when you are ready. I would ask that my estate advisor, Miss Ashby, be included in the record, as she has prepared the estate's response to the proposed extension agreement." There was a brief silence. Greaves looked from Frederick to Imogen and back to Frederick with the expression of a man recalculating the architecture of an arrangement he had believed was already decided. "Miss Ashby is Lord Carew's relation," Greaves said. "She is not a qualified estate solicitor." "She is not," Frederick agreed. "She is, however, the person who identified the revenue implications of your proposed agreement in sufficient detail that I believe the council will want to consider her analysis before we proceed." Greaves looked at Imogen. She looked back at him with the particular steadiness of a woman who had held a creditor conversation in a home estate office, alone at 25, and had not required rescue. She set her document set on the table. "The proposed 20-year extension," she said, without preface, "transfers timber revenue rights in excess of the written-down debt by a factor of approximately 2.5, under standard market projections. I have documented this across 4 revenue scenarios, with the ledger entries available for review. I have also prepared 3 alternative debt restructure proposals that achieve the council's stated objective: resolution of the drainage debt, without the long-term revenue cost to the estate. The room did not erupt. There was a long, suspended moment during which the 7 men on the opposite side of the table processed the information that the meeting they had prepared for was not the meeting that was occurring. The man to Greaves's right, an older investor named Blackwood, whom Sir Edmund had identified as the council's most principled member, leaned forward and said, "May I see the comparison table?" She passed him a copy. He read it in silence. Then he said, without looking at Greaves, "These figures are correct." "They are approximate," Imogen said. "The timber market projections carry a standard range. I have shown the conservative scenario, the current market scenario, and an optimistic scenario. In all three, the cost to the estate exceeds the debt write-down." Greaves said, with a quietness that was not calm but controlled, "The proposal was developed in good faith, Miss Ashby. I have no reason to doubt that," she said, and she meant it. She was not accusing anyone of bad faith. She was presenting numbers. "The alternative proposals I have offered are also in good faith. I believe any of the three would serve the council's interest in debt resolution without the revenue cost to the estate." Blackwood put down the document. He looked at Frederick, then he looked at Imogen, with the particular expression of a man revising a category he had not known he was applying. "She has done excellent work," he said, to Frederick, which was not the address Imogen would have chosen, but was, under the circumstances, more than adequate. Frederick said, "Yes," nothing further. Greaves did not collapse or concede dramatically. What he did was more satisfying than that. He sat back from the table slightly, in the specific way of a man who has understood that the version of this meeting that exists in his preparation is not the version that is going to be recorded, and made a decision to negotiate. "I will review the alternative proposals," he said. He did not look at Imogen when he said it, but he picked up her document set and set it in front of him, with a deliberateness that was its own form of acknowledgement. The meeting ran 2.5 hours. By the end, the council had accepted the principle of the 8-year structured repayment proposal, the one that cost the estate $300 annually but returned full timber revenue at year 8, and had agreed to a solicitor's review of the amended terms. Blackwood had asked Imogen 2 further questions during the session, both of which she had answered without consulting her notes. The third time he did this, he addressed the question directly to her rather than routing it through Frederick, which was noticed by everyone in the room and unacknowledged by anyone. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. After the council members had filed out, Frederick remained at the table. Imogen was gathering her document sets, aligning them into their original order. The fire had caught properly now, and the room was finally warm. He said, from the end of the table, "Blackwood will tell the county. He tells everyone everything, but he tells it accurately." She looked up. "That seems manageable. It will change some conversations." Several conversations needed changing. She secured the last document and looked at him. He was watching her from the length of the table, with the particular expression she had named by now, though she had not named it aloud. "Your Grace, the matter of the Greaves Council agreement resolves a significant estate liability. That should not be outweighed in anyone's consideration by questions about my position here." "It will be outweighed by some," he said. "Greaves will not be pleasant about this. I have managed unpleasant creditors before." "I know," he said. And the particular quality of those 2 words, the precise weight of them, the knowledge they contained, the length of the investigation, and the care of the attention, and the 14 pages of a report he had read twice in a library on an October evening, sat in the room like a note played in a key she had not known was available. She held it for a moment, then she picked up her documents and said, "I'll have the amended terms drafted by Friday," and left the room, because she needed to be somewhere else for a few minutes in order to think clearly, and she was not going to cry in Frederick Ashmore's council chamber. She did not cry. She stood in the corridor outside for perhaps 4 minutes, with one hand pressed briefly against the stone wall, and then she straightened her spine and walked back toward the accounts office. Miss Constance Alderley and her mother had attended the previous evening's dinner and had been at the house for 4 days. On the afternoon of the 23rd, Imogen was crossing the hall when Mrs. Alderley intercepted her with the specific intentionality of a woman who had decided that a direct approach was now required. "It must be gratifying," Mrs. Alderley said pleasantly, "to have been so useful to His Grace. An estate in good order is such a foundation for a household." She paused. "Though of course the requirements of a ducal household extend well beyond accounts." "Of course," Imogen said. "Miss Constance plays beautifully. Did you hear her last evening?" I was in the accounts office last evening. Naturally, Mrs. Alderley's smile completed the point she did not state aloud, which was that accounts offices and ballrooms occupied different universes, and that Imogen had correctly identified her own. Imogen looked at her with the level attention she gave to every source of information, relevant or not. Miss Constance plays beautifully, she said. She is a credit to her family. Then she went back to the accounts office, because she had a timber revenue document to finalize, and because Mrs. Alderley's architectural certainty was not a fact about the world. It was a prediction, and predictions were only as accurate as the information behind them, and the information was changing. Philippa appeared at the accounts office door at 4:30, leaned against the frame, and said, "She came for you. I know. You gave her nothing. There was nothing to give her that she would have received correctly." Philippa was quiet for a moment, then she said, "He is going to offer for you. I believe you already know this." Imogen did not answer immediately. She aligned the edges of the timber document on the desk. "I know that he asked Lord Carew for a trial arrangement with the possibility of permanence. What I know about his grace is that he is precise, and he does not say things he does not mean." "Then you know." She had known for some time. The difficulty was not knowing. It was deciding what to do with what she knew, which required her to be accurate about her own position, and not merely reactive to an unprecedented circumstance. She had been given to understand, by the architecture of her life, that she was not someone who received what the world called good outcomes, not through romantic selection, not through inheritance, not through any mechanism the world considered standard. She had made her peace with this, not through resignation, but through the construction of a sufficiency that did not depend on it. To undo that construction now, to allow herself to need an outcome she could not guarantee, was a different kind of risk than any she had managed before. She had managed £420 annually in recovered margin. She had managed a council meeting in a room of 7 hostile investors. She had managed Greer at 25, with a ledger and a solicitor's address. She could manage this, but she was not going to decide it carelessly. Frederick asked Lord Carew's formal permission via letter on the 26th of January. Lord Carew came to Wentmore Hall on the 30th, in the particular flurry of a man who has been surprised by news he considers good, and is managing the surprise by being in motion. He brought Miss Honoria Carew and spent the afternoon in the drawing room, and in the evening's dinner, seated across from Imogen and the Duke with the expression of a man reassessing 7 years of household management through a substantially revised lens. After dinner, Frederick found Imogen in the music room. She had not been playing. She had been sitting at the instrument with the cover closed, thinking, which was a thing she sometimes did in the rooms she found quietest. He knocked, entered, and sat down in the chair nearest the door, which was not near the instrument, and left a considerable space between them. "You found the library archive structure," he said. She was still. "I restored it to its original organization. Your mother's system was sound. It had simply been disturbed over time. My mother organized it in 1829, he said. No one has touched it since 1834. I assumed the original system was no longer recoverable." She did not say anything. "It is not a small thing," he said, "to have noticed it, to have taken the time." The fire in the music room was low. Outside, January pressed against the windows in the way of cold that has been there for a long time and is not in any particular hurry to leave. She looked at her hands on the cover of the instrument and then looked at him. "There is a formal arrangement your solicitor has proposed," she said. "There is. And there is what you actually intend to say, which is different." He was quiet for a moment. This did not feel like a pause before an answer. It felt like a man deciding how much of the accurate thing to give. "Not because it is convenient or appropriate, or fitted the requirements my position imposes," he said, "but because you restored my mother's archive without being asked, and without mentioning it to anyone. Because you straightened my cravat, as though it were simply the next correct thing. Because you walked into that council chamber on the 22nd with 14 days of work, and presented it without performing anything, and Blackwood, who has not changed his mind about anything since 1832, stopped routing his questions through me. Because I have been looking, for a long time, for someone who understands what the actual work is, and you have never not understood it." She held this. It was not comfortable, precisely. It was, however, true in a way she could verify against her own record of the preceding weeks, and she had a thorough record. She thought about her father's study in Salisbury, and the 730 pounds, and the afternoon she had sat with the actual number, and decided she was not going to become less. She thought about the estate office at Ashworth Park, and the creditor and the ledger and the solicitor's name, and the 5 minutes after he left. She thought about 14 pages in a report that had found her in a room full of performance and described her accurately. She was not going to step aside for the possibility of disappointment. She was going to answer the actual question. Yes, she said, simply and directly, in the way she answered all questions she had thought through completely. He did not move immediately. He looked at her with the expression she had long since named to herself, but had not said aloud, which was the expression of a man who has been making precise and careful decisions for a long time and has just discovered that the most important one has been answered with a simplicity he had not permitted himself to expect. Then he stood, crossed the room, and sat beside her on the instrument bench, which was an action that required nothing at all from the social structures that had governed every other moment of the preceding weeks, and everything from the two of them privately. They were married on the 17th of March, 1849, at the parish church near Wentmore Hall, in a ceremony attended by 112 guests, and notable, in the account that Sir Edmund wrote to his former Chancery colleague the following week, for the particular quality of the Duke's attention throughout, which was not the performed solemnity of a man executing a social obligation, but the particular focused quiet of a man standing in the room where the most important thing he has done is occurring. Lord Carew attended and appeared genuinely moved, which Imogen found she did not resent. He had not looked very carefully, but he had not been cruel, and carelessness was not the same as malice, and she had 7 years of accounts that stood to her credit regardless of his attention. Miss Constance Alderley sent a correct and pleasant note that arrived the following week, and was seen to be engaged to the heir of a Derbyshire baronetcy by the following autumn, which resolved her story with a neatness that Imogen found, on balance, appropriate. Horace Greaves signed the amended 8-year repayment agreement in February, and never became comfortable in the same room as Imogen, but never again brought an underprepared proposal to the council table, which was the only form of recalibration that the situation required. The Duke of Wentmore's father, the 4th Duke, had been dead 10 years by the time of the marriage, which meant the patriarchal gate operated in this case through the ghost of expectation rather than the voice of a living man. It was Frederick's great-uncle, an Earl of 76 who had known the 4th Duke well, who came to the house in April and sat with Frederick in the library for an afternoon and said, afterward, in the corridor where Imogen happened to be passing, "She is not what I would have chosen." He paused. He was looking at the restored archives section she had reorganized in February, which now held its original labels in the original system his niece, Frederick's mother, had established in 1829. "Your mother," he said, "would have recognized her immediately," and he said nothing further, and went to his carriage. She had managed the estate's quarterly accounts for 3 years before the weight of what they had built became visible enough to name. By the spring of 1852, the timber revenue restructure had returned the estate its first full unreduced seasonal yield. The tenant lease reform she had extended from Ashworth's model was in operation across 46 of the 52 Wentmore farms, with a delinquency rate of near 0. She had drafted, at Sir Edmund's request and Blackwood's eventual endorsement, a standardized account management template that 3 neighboring estates had adopted, with attribution, for their own creditor review processes. It was a document of 11 pages, organized by quarter and cross-referenced by supplier category, and it was, in its small and entirely unromantic way, the clearest record of what she had understood for her entire adult life, that the actual work was specific and patient and worth doing correctly, and that someone had to do it. Their son, Thomas Frederick Ashmore, was born in November of 1851 and secured the succession of the Wentmore dukedom in the straightforward way of a baby who was present, healthy, and documented in the appropriate parish records. He had his father's precise attention and, by the time he was 18 months old, a clear preference for being in whatever room Imogen was working in, which she found both entirely understandable and productively inconvenient. She had made him a small account ledger from 3 sheets of household paper folded and bound with string, which he carried in his fist, with the particular determination of someone who does not yet know what it is for, but understands that it matters. Mrs. Grant remained at Wentmore Hall through all of it, and continued to provide cups of tea at structurally important moments, with the reliability of a woman who had long ago decided that warmth was a form of precision. Philippa Forsyth was married in 1850 to a man who managed a charitable school in the county, and she and Imogen continued to argue, productively and with genuine pleasure, about account methodology and the proper governance of rural charitable institutions for the next several decades. It was a Tuesday in April, 1853, when Imogen was sitting at the estate desk with the quarterly accounts open before her, and Thomas was asleep in the nursery above, that she became aware of Frederick standing in the doorway of the accounts office. He had been there for some time. She knew this without looking, the way she knew the balance of a ledger before she had finished adding the final column, by accumulated evidence, by the particular texture of a room when someone is in it who belongs there. She continued writing the entry she was completing. Outside, the April light lay across the Wentmore parkland in the long, unhurried way of a day that has no particular urgency, and the estate was as she had found it, and more than she had found it, and Thomas was sleeping above, and would wake in 40 minutes, and require a significant quantity of attention, and the accounts were in order. She finished the entry, she set down her pen, she looked up at Frederick in the doorway. He was watching her with the expression she had named 4 years ago, on a January evening in a music room, and had continued to verify, as accurate in every year since. "The quarterly balance," she said. "It is correct." "I expected nothing less," he said. She looked at him across the estate desk, and the accounts, and the 4 years of a life they had built with the same methodology she had always used, accurately, patiently, from the actual numbers, without stepping aside for anything that did not deserve the space. "Come in," she said, "or go, but the draft from the door is doing nothing useful for the ink." He came in, he closed the door, and that was, simply and entirely, that.